The first thing Marin Solis noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, the dig site was loud enough. Generators coughing diesel smoke into the main pre-dawn, the hydraulic groan of the drill rig turning its third consecutive overnight shift. She meant the other silence. The one she'd learned to notice after 7 years, cataloging pre-Columbian signal anomalies in the bedrock of the northeastern seaboard. The silence of instruments that should have been chattering with background noise and weren't. Her handheld magnetometer read 0, not low, not fluctuating 0. She shook it, checked the battery, held it up toward the generator and got nothing, which meant the sensor was live. The field around the drill collar should have been a mess of electromagnetic interference. Instead, 0. Huh, she said to nobody. 12 feet away, the drill punched through into something and stopped. The operator killed the motor on reflex. You always did when you hit a void. The bit had been rotating at 4,200 feet when it dropped into open space. That wasn't supposed to exist here. The geological surveys had shown solid granite all the way to 6,000 feet. Continental basement rock, Precambrian, older than multicellular life. Marin was already pulling on her hard hat when the EMP hit. She woke up in the mud, 40 feet from where she'd been standing, with no memory of the in-between. Her teeth ached. The generator was silent. Every phone on the site was dark. 3 of her grad students were picking themselves up from the ground. One of them, Danny, 22 years old, nose ring and a Boston University hoodie, was staring at the drill rig with her mouth open because the drill collar was glowing. A warm amber that faded even as Marin watched it, leaving behind a smell like ozone and something older, something she couldn't name. The shockwave had traveled at the speed of thought. 43 seconds after the drill punched through, a power substation in Nova Scotia exploded. 17 seconds after that, a grain elevator in Quebec shook itself apart. A bridge in Newfoundland lost 6 suspension cables simultaneously. In 12 minutes, an emergency operations center in Washington was running on backup generators and tracking signal anomalies cascading across the North Atlantic seaboard. And nobody had an explanation for any of it. Marin had an explanation. She just knew nobody was going to like it. The signal had been pulsing for 11 months before the drill broke through. Marin had been the only person tracking it, partly because her equipment was sensitive enough to catch it, and partly because she had the kind of reputation that made other scientists politely change the subject at conferences. The university tolerated her because her field school generated tuition revenue, and her grant applications, while unorthodox, were technically compliant. What she published in the mainstream journals was solid. What she published everywhere else was, depending on who you asked, either visionary or delusional. She believed there was a network, ancient, global, built from something that wasn't stone and wasn't metal, or rather, wasn't only those things. A lab of sites spread across 6 continents, each one positioned at a node in a planetary electromagnetic grid, each one constructed with a precision that had nothing to do with the civilizations that supposedly built them, and everything to do with whoever had taught those civilizations. The sites were receivers, or transmitters, or both. She'd been arguing this for 6 years. She had 63 pages of signal data, 14 independent triangulations, and 3 peer reviewers who had called her work interesting but unverifiable. The drill site in Maine was one of the nodes. She'd been trying to reach it for 2 years. Now something had answered. She drove to Washington with her laptop open on the passenger seat, field data scrolling, watching the Cascade reports update in real time. By the time she crossed into Maryland, the first reports were coming in from across the Atlantic, from England. Stonehenge was moving, not the stones, or not just the stones. The ground around Stonehenge was moving, compressing according to the seismic reports. The bluestones and the sarcens were repositioning themselves along the site perimeter with a grinding slowness, like something waking up. Tourists had been evacuated. A BBC helicopter was streaming aerial footage. Watching the footage on her phone at a red light, Marin felt her stomach go cold because what she was seeing wasn't geological activity. The stones were moving to specific positions, precise positions. Positions she recognized from her own signal models as optimal nodes for focused electromagnetic transmission. Stonehenge was not waking up. It was calibrating. Her phone rang before she could think through what that meant. The number was a government area code, and she almost didn't answer, because government area codes had a way of leading to rooms where she sat across a table from people who smiled without warmth and asked her to stop publishing. But something made her pick up. The voice on the other end said, "Dr. Solis." My name is Coordinator Reeves. I'm calling from DARPA. We've been monitoring your signal data for the last 9 months. We'd like to discuss what just happened in Maine. She said, I'd like to discuss what's about to happen in England. There was a pause. We were hoping you'd say that. We have a plane waiting. The operations room in the converted Era F building smelled like cold coffee and recycled air. Screens covered 2 full walls, satellite feeds, seismic overlays, electromagnetic readings from monitoring stations across Europe. In the center of the room, a 3-dimensional terrain model of the Salisbury Plain showed Stonehenge as a pulsing amber node, with concentric rings of field strength, rippling outward in regular intervals. Each ring corresponded to a shockwave. Each shockwave had done something. In the most recent event, 40 minutes ago, 5 people within 300 meters of the stones had been reported missing. No bodies, no debris, just gone. The British military liaison, a colonel named Hargreaves, showed Marin the footage without comment. She watched a man in a high-visibility vest walk into the edge of the amber light and come apart. Not violently, that was the part she couldn't stop replaying. He just unraveled. Like a signal losing coherence. How many total, she asked. 11 confirmed. We believe the number will rise. Hargreaves had the kind of face that had stopped registering horror, which meant he'd been looking at these feeds for longer than she had. The exclusion zone is currently 500 meters. We're debating extending it to 2 kilometers. Extend it to 5. She turned to the signal board. The pulse interval is decreasing. It started at 43 minutes per cycle. Current interval is 31. When it reaches 12, the field strength will triple. You're confident of that calculation. I've been modeling this node network for 6 years. That site, she pointed at the pulsing amber shape on the terrain model, is not a monument. It never was. It's an antenna array, specifically designed for focused directional transmission. The stones aren't decoration. They're waveguides. Whoever built this thing built it to point at something specific. She pulled up her signal triangulation. When the array fully calibrates, and it will, within 30 to 36 hours, it's going to transmit upward on a frequency I don't have a name for yet, but which I've been detecting echoes of in the bedrock of 6 continents. The room had gotten very quiet. Transmit to what? Reeves asked from across the room. Marin had been thinking about say this for 11 months. She still hadn't found a version that didn't sound like she'd lost her mind. Something that's been waiting for the signal, she said. Something that built this network and left it here a very long time ago. His name was Cale Morrow, and he had been right about everything for so long that being right had stopped feeling like a victory. She found him in the mobile command unit they'd parked on the outer edge of the exclusion zone, a converted panel van with enough signal equipment to embarrass most university departments, staffed by a single folding chair, a space heater, and Cale Morrow eating a protein bar and watching waveform readouts with the patient intensity of someone who had given up expecting anyone else to share his concern. He was 41, unshaven, wearing a jacket that had seen better decades. He had a PhD in astrophysics from Cambridge that he no longer mentioned in polite company, a decade of independent research that the scientific community had quietly blacklisted, and a radio show. Low-frequency AM broadcast, illegal transmitter, rotating frequency so the regulators couldn't pin him down, with an audience of approximately 200,000 people who'd all been told the same thing Marin had been told. Interesting but unverifiable. He was the one who'd first published the node network theory. 7 years before Marin had arrived at the same conclusion independently. She said, "You were right," he said. "I know. How bad is it?" She showed him the signal data. He ate the rest of his protein bar without tasting it. "The calibration sequence," he said finally. "I modeled it 3 years ago, based on the pulse intervals from the minor events, the ones they kept writing off as natural EM fluctuations. I thought I had the timing wrong because the math kept coming up faster than felt plausible." He looked at her. 36 hours? Best case, and your main chamber triggered it. My drill triggered it. There's a receiving mechanism buried down there, same material as the stones, same signal signature. I think the main site is the key element in the network, the anchor node. Whatever is at the center of this system was waiting for that specific site to be activated before it began the transmission sequence. Cale was quiet for a moment. "That's elegant," he said, which was not the response she expected. "Think about it from a design perspective. You seed a planet, you leave a network. You hide the activation key at the deepest node, the one that requires the most technological development to reach. The species either develops the tools to reach it, in which case they've demonstrated the level of advancement required, or they don't. The fact that we found it means something. It means we the threshold for what? He looked at the waveform readouts. The pulse interval had dropped to 28 minutes while they'd been talking. Evaluation, he said, or harvest, or reset, depending on who you're asking. What nobody in the operations room wanted to say out loud was that the military option was already on the table. A nuclear warhead could reach Stonehenge from a submarine in the English Channel in under 4 minutes. The warhead would certainly destroy the site. Whether that would stop the transmission sequence, or simply trigger it, prematurely, was a question nobody could answer with confidence. And confidence was what the people authorizing the launch required. So the launch waited, and the clock ticked down, and Marin and Kale worked. They worked the way people work when sleep is a luxury they've already spent. On fumes and coffee, and the kind of granular focus that only arrives when the alternative is catastrophe. Karen's field data and Kale's theoretical models were complementary in ways neither of them had anticipated, their independent paths to the same conclusion, having sharpened different facets of the same diamond. Together, they could see what neither could see alone. There was a counter mechanism. That was the thing Kale had found 3 years ago and been unable to fully explain, an anomaly in the signal pattern that looked like interference but wasn't. It was a secondary frequency nested inside the primary pulse, running slightly out of phase. He'd modeled it as noise at first, then as an echo, and finally arrived at a theory he'd never published because even by his standards it was too far out. The network had been built with a failsafe, not against failure, against completion. Why would you build a failsafe into a harvest mechanism? Marin asked him. At 2 in the morning, in the panel van, with the waveform showing 21 minutes between pulses. You wouldn't, Kale said, unless the species you seeded wasn't the species you were harvesting for. Unless you were seeding a planet with one intent, and someone else modified your network. She stared at him. You're saying someone else added a countermeasure. I'm saying the network has 2 authors. The primary structure and the failsafe don't match. Different design philosophy. The primary system treats the planet as a resource. The failsafe treats the inhabitants as agents. The failsafe requires a biological input to activate. Specifically, a biological input from a species with a certain level of electromagnetic sensitivity, interface directly with the counter-signal transmitter. Where's the transmitter? There's a museum in Edinburgh, Kale said. That has a piece of decorative stonework in its prehistory collection that has been baffling archaeologists since 1923 because it doesn't match any known culture's craftsmanship, and it emits a persistent low-level EM signal that they keep writing off as instrument error. He looked at her. It's not instrument error. The problem was Lechem. Dr. Joseph Lechem had been a colleague of Kale's once. A theorist with a gift for mathematics and a hunger for significance that had eventually swallowed everything else. He'd arrived at the node network theory independently, like Marin had, and his response had been categorically different from either of theirs. Where Marin had seen a scientific puzzle, and Kale had seen a warning, Lechem had seen a scripture. He had built a community around his interpretation. A compound in the Maine woods, ironic in hindsight, given the proximity to the activation node, where several hundred people had gathered to wait for what Lechem called the recurrence, the end of the current cycle and the beginning of the next. Lechem believed the network had been built for humanity, not against it. He believed the transmission sequence would not destroy the planet but transform it. He had been telling his community this for 4 years. He also, unfortunately, had the Edinburgh piece. He had acquired it through channels that the museum's board was currently in the process of discovering were not, legally speaking, legitimate, and it was now at his compound in Maine, which put it 40 minutes from the activation node and 12 hours by ground transport from Stonehenge. He's not going to let us take it, Kale said. He might, Marin said. If I explain, he won't. There was something in Kale's voice she hadn't heard before. A wait. I know him. We argued about this for 2 years before I understood what he'd become. He believes he's right. That's the worst kind of obstacle. People who know they might be wrong can be reasoned with. They drove to the compound anyway. Time had collapsed to 17 minutes between pulses, and the exclusion zone at Stonehenge had been extended to 3 kilometers after 2 more people vanished. The compound was quiet in the way that places are quiet when the people inside are absolutely certain of something. A few dozen people on the perimeter, unhurried, watching the sky with the patient expectancy of people who had been told exactly what was coming and had decided to welcome it. Marin had expected hostility. She got serenity, which was worse. Lashem met them in a building he called the Archive. He was a tall man with the cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to, and he listened to Marin's explanation with his hands folded and his expression composed. And when she finished, he said, "You've come to take the key." "We need it to stop the transmission sequence," Marin said. "I know." He looked at Kale with something that might have been sorrow. "I designed that application myself years ago, before I understood what I was actually looking at. The biological interface. The counter signal. I thought I'd found a weapon, then I understood I'd found a test." He looked back at Marin. "The test is whether we intervene, whether we try to stop what's coming." "The people who disappeared from the exclusion zone," Marin said carefully, "were vaporized by an electromagnetic pulse. They weren't ready. They were tourists. One of them was a surveyor's assistant." Lashem said nothing. "The counter mechanism exists," Kale said from behind her. "You know it exists. You modeled it. Whoever added it to the network, they weren't trying to preserve the harvest. They were giving the species a choice. A door. You could walk through it." Something shifted in Lashem's face. Not much. A hairline fracture in a very composed surface. "If I give you the key," he said, "and you activate the counter mechanism, and you're wrong, if I'm right, and the recurrence is a passage rather than a destruction, then you'll have closed the door." "If you're right," Marin said, "and we activate the counter mechanism, then the worst thing that happens is the recurrence is delayed. Your community survives to be right." She kept her voice level. "If we're right, and you keep the key, then nobody survives to be anything." The fracture held. Then Lashem laughed softly, and it was not the laugh of a man who thought he was losing. It was the laugh of a man who had already decided and was waiting to see if anyone else would notice. "It's in the second room," he said. "Take it." She almost didn't make it. The pulse interval had reached 14 minutes by the time the military transport landed at Heathrow. Kale had the piece wrapped in a Faraday cage, which was probably futile, but was the closest thing to a protocol they had. Marin had been on the phone for 4 hours with the signal team back at the RAF building, walking them through the activation sequence, trying to map the counter signal's initiation frequency to hardware they actually had. The problem was the biological interface. Kale's model was clear. The counter mechanism required a direct biological input at a very specific EM frequency, the frequency produced by the human nervous system under acute stress, specifically the kind of acute stress generated by voluntary, fully conscious decision in the face of mortal danger. Not panic, not fight or flight, the deliberate, clear-eyed choice. "You're describing a system," Marin said, "that was built to respond specifically to the moment a human being decides, knowing the cost." "Yes," Kale said. "That's why it can't be automated." "Yes." She looked out the transport window at the English countryside scrolling past, green and gray under a November sky, and thought about the people who had built that secondary system, the ones who had come after the original architects, with a different philosophy, and added a counter to someone else's harvest. She wondered if they had been this species' ancestors, or something else entirely, or some third option she didn't have language for yet. She wondered if they had known, building the failsafe, that it would require exactly this, that it would require a specific biological creature to make a specific kind of choice in a specific kind of moment. She wondered if they had trusted that the creature would. The exclusion zone came into view from the helicopter, and she stopped wondering, because the stones were fully calibrated now, and the input was no longer pulsing. It was constant. A column of it, straight up from the center of the hinge, visible from 6 miles in every direction, rising into the sky and narrowing to something that was either vanishing into the clouds or continuing far beyond them. 12 minutes to transmission. The signal team had confirmed it. The helicopter pilot looked at her and waited for an order. "Put me down inside the zone," she said. "The thing about standing inside an alien array that is in the process of transmitting a signal to something very far away is that it should feel enormous, and it doesn't. It feels quiet." The amber light was warm and omnidirectional and didn't cast shadows. The ground underfoot was ordinary grass, slightly damp. The stones, repositioned over 30 hours into a configuration no satellite image had seen before, rose around her in a perfect inward-facing spiral, and they were enormous. The sarsens, 10 meters tall, 40 tons each. But they didn't feel threatening. They felt purposeful, which was almost worse. Kale had walked her through the activation sequence 4 times on the transport. The piece from the Edinburgh Museum, The counter-signal transmitter, no larger than a hardback book, dense and cold in her hands despite the warmth of the light, needed to be brought into direct contact with the central ground node, which was the bare chalk exposed at the center of the henge. It needed to be held there, in skin contact, for the duration of the initiation sequence. Duration unknown. The biological interface needed to be maintained continuously. She had asked him what maintained meant precisely, and he had looked at her with the expression of someone who had worked out an unpleasant answer a long time ago and had been waiting to have to say it. The system is reading the nervous system of whoever holds the interface, he said. It's not passive, it's dialogic, it's asking. And the response has to come from the nervous system directly, not from a proxy or a mechanism. The response is the choice. And the choice has to be sustained, for as long as the counter signal takes to complete. She hadn't asked how long that was. She had a rough idea from the model, and rough was enough. The warhead was coming. She hadn't been told this officially, but she had been in the operations room long enough to understand how these decisions worked. And the timeline was clear. The military didn't have another option, and they knew it. They had seen what happened to people who walked into the field strength unprepared, and they had run their calculus, and the submarine in the English Channel had received an authorization code approximately 8 minutes ago. The warhead would arrive at the henge in just under 4 minutes from the moment she'd stepped off the helicopter. 4 minutes was either more than enough or not enough at all. She knelt at the center of the henge, on the chalk, and pressed the counter-signal transmitter flat against the ground with both hands, and closed her eyes. The thing about the biological interface was that it didn't hurt. She had expected pain, it seemed congruent with the situation, but what she got instead was clarity, an expansion, as though she had been thinking through a window all her life, and someone had just taken the glass out. The signal moved through her, not like electricity, more like language. Not words, but the structure beneath words, the deep grammar of intention. Something the part of her brain that processed pattern recognized before the part that processed meaning could catch up. It was asking, not in any language she knew, not in any framework she had words for. But she had been a signal analyst for 12 years, and she understood the shape of a question even when she didn't understand its content. And this was unambiguously a question. She answered the only way the system could read, with the full weight of a voluntary, fully conscious, clear-eyed choice. The countersignal initiated. She felt it more than heard it. A frequency rising beneath her palms, through the chalk, through the stone beneath the chalk, through whatever lay beneath the stone, rising through the henge, through the waveguides, up through the amber column of light. Not stopping the primary transmission, answering it, overlaying it with a second voice that said, in the deep grammar of intention, "We know what this is. We know what you built. We are still here, and we are aware, and we are choosing." The warhead was 90 seconds out. The amber light shifted, not off, not suddenly, not dramatically. A slow change in color temperature, from amber towards something cooler, something she didn't have a name for. The column narrowed. The pulse interval, which had been on a steady countdown toward transmission, stabilized, then reversed, 60 seconds. The stones groaned. Not from seismic stress, the seismic sensors had flatlined, but from whatever forces operated the mechanisms within them. She heard grinding, repositioning, a low, sustained vibration that she felt more in her sternum than in her ears. 30 seconds, she was still holding the transmitter. Her hands were numb. She could feel the counter signal still moving through her, still asking, and she was still answering, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping would be its own answer, and that was not the answer she had come here to give. She was frightened, that was honest. But the fear was at a distance now, in the way that important things can be at a distance when you are fully occupied with one specific action. And the action was simple. Hold on. Keep choosing. The warhead entered the field. What happened next was something she would spend the rest of her life attempting to describe, and mostly failing. The counter signal, fully initiated, encountered the warhead's velocity and heat signature, and treated them the same way it had treated the primary transmission signal, as input to be answered. The energy dissipated, not absorbed, not deflected, answered, converted. The warhead ceased to be a warhead somewhere in the column of narrowing light and became, briefly, something else. And then the light went out. The henge was silent, the amber was gone. The stones stood where they had always stood. No, not quite, she realized, looking around. They were back in their original positions. The configuration they'd held for 5,000 years before 36 hours ago. as though someone had pressed reset. Marin sat back on the chalk and looked at the sky, which was ordinary and gray and beginning to spit rain, and felt the transmitter in her hands cool against her palms, and breathed. Her phone miraculously had a signal. Kale picked up on the first ring. She said, "It's done." He said, "I know. We saw the field collapse from here. The seismic network is clear. The pulse sequence has stopped." A pause. "How are you?" She looked at her hands. Steady. She'd thought they might shake. They didn't. "Cold," she said. "Can you come get me?" The official report, released 6 months later, attributed the electromagnetic anomalies to a previously unknown geological phenomenon, and the disappearances near the exclusion zone to a cascade failure of the site's structural integrity, compounded by atmospheric effects. The Edinburgh piece was logged as recovered from an unlicensed private collection and returned to storage. Marin's field data was classified. Kale's radio show was subject to a cease and desist that he ignored, broadcasting from a different location every week. The thing about the report that bothered Marin specifically was not its dishonesty. She had expected dishonesty. Dishonesty was a bureaucratic survival mechanism, and she understood its logic. What bothered her was a single line in the appendix that she only found because she'd been given access to the unredacted version, and she'd read every word. The line read, "Transmission sequence reached 94% completion before countersignal initiated. Analysis of final signal data suggests transmission was received at destination and generated a response. Nature of response, unknown." She read it 3 times, then she closed the file and put it in a desk drawer and went to make coffee. The response was unknown, which meant the response was real. Which meant someone, a very long way away, had been listening for a very long time, and had just been told. By a nervous system pressed flat against ancient chalk in the rain. By the deliberate, clear-eyed choice of a frightened and determined woman who had decided that humanity's first message to the cosmos was going to be refusal. That the planet was occupied. That the species had noticed the network and found the door and chosen to hold it open rather than walk through it. That they were here. That they were choosing. That they would keep choosing. She drank her coffee standing at the window, watching the rain come down over a city that didn't know how close it had come to having the conversation had for them. And she thought about Kale's question, why would you build a failsafe into a harvest mechanism? And she thought about the secondary authors, whoever they were, the ones who had added a counter to someone else's design. She thought, maybe they were seeded too once. Maybe they found their own network. Maybe they made their own choice in the dark, pressing their equivalent of hands against their equivalent of chalk. And the answer they sent changed something. Maybe that's what the failsafe was in the end. Not a weapon or a countermeasure, but a letter. From one world to another. From one species to whatever came after. Written in the only language that travels across the distance between stars without losing anything. We were here, we chose. You can too. She finished her coffee. She had a paper to write. It would never be published in any journal that anyone in the mainstream community read. And it would reach exactly the audience that needed to read it. And that was enough. Outside, rain on the glass. The city going about its ordinary business. Billions of people living their lives at the edge of a conversation they would never know had taken place. She started writing.